that in the sky?" A phrase heard far too often to rule out the possibility of aliens on Earth. Unidentified flying objects come in all shapes and sizes. Some are found to be our usually secret crafts, while others remain unexplainable. Most of these UFOs share several reoccurrences. Over time, thorough research has been carried out on the subject to help us identify just what their similarities are. Ufologists worldwide have now established an official checklist answering the question, what makes a UFO undeniably alien? Whichever way we look at it, 2021 was a remarkable year for the UFO subject, mostly due to the highly anticipated Pentagon report, a report that neither confirmed nor dismissed the existence of these unearthly craft. There is no doubt that the subject of UFOs has been taken more seriously in recent years. More often than not, news reports on the subject are no longer tongue-in-cheek or of an outright mocking nature. And with disclosures on the rise, this will only continue. Indeed, interest in the subject is arguably higher than it has been for decades. When studying UFOs, researchers use a system called the 5 observables, 5 specific traits of these strange and unknown vehicles. What is interesting, although not surprising, is that these traits match descriptions from many UFO accounts that span decades. This perhaps adds a little more credibility to both those reports and the 5 observables themselves. So what are the 5 specific traits of these mysterious vehicles that are seemingly shared by most and are unique to them? The first observable is an object's ability to overcome the Earth's gravity, and they do so with no visible means of force. They also have no wings of any kind. In short, according to our understanding of aviation, they shouldn't be able to fly. It's worth noting that countless reports of UFOs speak of this seemingly anti-gravity technology. For example, many witnesses of these strange objects state that there's no visible means of propulsion, no wings, nor even a vapor trail of some kind. Could this be the kind of technology that results in their perfect silence? What's also interesting is that many whistleblowers have stated similar things. The most notable is perhaps Bob Lazar, who made some startling revelations in the late 1980s. He claimed that he'd worked for several years with alien technology. He also offered insights into how UFOs traverse the planet, in effect manipulating gravity. He stated that these alien crafts use antimatter reactors that created their own gravity field, adding that it was this technology that makes manipulation of space and time possible. He said that the alien vehicles he'd worked with had 3 gravity amplifiers on their underside, which would focus their energy to a specific destination, actually transporting that destination to the vehicle. He explained that this bending of space-time was like having a big stone sitting on a sheet of rubber. The gravity field then pulls the desired destination to it. When the gravity amplifiers are shut off, the destination returns to its former position, taking the object with it. While Lazar regards the propulsion methods of these highly advanced crafts through space as relatively easy, he believes that traveling through the Earth's atmosphere is much less so. Lazar claims that both the strong gravitational pull of Earth, as well as the intense weather systems, interfere with this technology. So, if we assume this information is accurate, this might be why these highly advanced vehicles seem to crash occasionally while roaming around our planet. Of course, whether Lazar is correct is another story. We simply need more evidence. In light of the official suggestion that these unknown objects are using technology to overcome the Earth's gravity, it's worth keeping an open mind. The second observable is sudden and instantaneous acceleration. According to many UFO reports, objects can seemingly go from standing still to instant movement. And if that weren't enough, they also have the ability to change direction instantly. By our understanding of physics, should a human attempt to pilot one of these objects, they simply wouldn't survive the G-forces and would ultimately be crushed to death. Perhaps even more intriguing, according to radar operators who've tracked these objects, they can descend from the sky at more than 30 times the speed of sound. Again, this is unheard of in terrestrial aircrafts. We're about to look at the 2004 USS Nimitz case, one of the key contributors for prompting this apparent new attitude towards the study of UFOs. Some of those involved have reported very specific details of these strange objects' movements that have contributed heavily to the 5 observables. One of the pilots who was sent to intercept the strange craft that day was Squadron Commander David Fravor. He states that the movements of the object resembled a ping-pong ball. Furthermore, radar operators noticed that it went from standing position to 60 miles per hour before traveling at 3,600 miles per hour. That's almost 3 times the speed of the FA-18 Super Hornet. These kinds of description can be found in multiple UFO reports, and not just reports from the ground, but reports from other pilots, commercial, private, and military, who've made eerily similar claims. This perhaps gives both the official and the civilian reports some degree of credibility. So when these crafts are traveling faster than the speed of sound, you'd expect a sonic boom, or at least some kind of vapor trail. However, these objects often shoot off rapidly without leaving anything behind. No impression whatsoever. There have been many UFO cases where the objects in question have simply disappeared within seconds without any trace. And once more, these reports come from both professional pilots and members of the public who've witnessed these strange objects from the ground. In fact, many of the close proximity sightings on Earth suggest the ability to go from touching the ground to becoming nothing but a dot in the sky within seconds. If that's true, the object would have to be traveling at breakneck speed, and this is usually in complete silence. Many skeptics of UFO sightings might argue that there's never been a clear photograph of a UFO, so therefore they don't exist. But several photographs do exist. It's also possible that some kind of low visibility or cloaking device is being utilized by extraterrestrials. This is certainly evident in the findings of those who put together the 5 observables. Looking at the notes and research of Bob Lazar, it's important to note why he thought some people simply do not see these strange crafts, even though they're hovering overhead. He says it all depends on where that person is standing on the ground relative to where the object is in the sky. Let's use an example. A person could be stood at location A, look up and clearly see a UFO overhead, whereas a person standing at location B, only several feet away, would not see it simply due to its cloaking or low visibility. In many of the reports from the USS Nimitz incident, it was stated that a strange haze appeared around the craft, making it difficult to see clearly. Was this a form of cloaking? If these crafts do have the advanced capability not only to hide from radar, but also to make themselves invisible to the human eye, then it suggests a highly advanced technology. They could be moving around our skies a lot more than we might think. Most intriguing of all, they appear to have the ability to travel through the air as well as on and under the water. How can some of them do this instantly without reconfiguring their structure? If we return to the USS Nimitz incident of 2004, witnesses stated that the UFO was hovering over the sea, causing a disturbance under the water's surface. Similarly, sonar operators later reported that they spotted a strange object moving underwater around twice as fast as a typical nuclear submarine. Surprisingly, there's been a growing consensus among UFO researchers that the depths of the planet's water might be an important key to unlocking the mystery of UFOs and aliens. Many UFOs are spotted near, over, or under the water. The fact that these futuristic vehicles can travel underwater as efficiently as they travel through the air adds a certain amount of credibility to such reports. So while we don't know what these objects are, or where they come from, we do know from the details provided that they far exceed the technology we have on Earth. And what's more, these sightings, officially recognized by the military, mirror many encounters from the civilian population that have taken place for decades. We must continue to listen to those who've spotted UFOs. While the word of one person might be questioned, you simply can't dismiss reports from thousands of people all over the world. How is it that sightings from two distant countries share striking similarities? Just what could be out there, traversing the skies of our planet? More importantly, why are these objects here in the first place, and where do they come from? As more information is released, we might one day have the answers to these burning questions. The story of Alashenka, the alien baby discovered near a small village in Russia, is without doubt one of the most unsettling but curious accounts on record. One that would result in missing evidence, strange and questionable deaths, and unanswered questions. Indeed, the account of Alashenka, including just who or what this strange creature was, remains as much of a mystery now as it did at the time it unfolded. According to most reports, one hot summer evening in 1996, in the small Russian village of Kyolenori near Kitsum, Russia, an elderly lady named Tamara was walking in the woods when she heard what she first believed was a small animal moving around in the trees. She turned to try to locate the direction the noise was coming from. As she was doing so, the sound turned to one that was more akin to a small child crying. She eventually located where the noise was coming from and began to approach it. To her disbelief, she saw a small creature, a child that had seemingly been abandoned. She quickly removed her shawl, reached down to pick up the child, and wrapped it in it. She quickly returned to her small apartment and named the baby Alashenka, and essentially began to treat as if it were her own offspring. The following day, however, when Tamara's daughter-in-law, who was also called Tamara, visited following a phone call from the elderly woman informing her that she had a new baby, she was horrified by what she saw. She would later describe the creature as being something that was not from this planet, and certainly didn't appear to be a human baby. The old lady's daughter-in-law found Alashenka's appearance decidedly unsettling. She recalled how it had a head that was too big for its body and onion-shaped. What's more, it had large eyes and only a small hole in its face that appeared to be some kind of nose. However, most disturbing of all, though, was when the elderly lady gave it food. The younger Tamara would later recall that she didn't once see the creature's mouth move while being fed, and that it appeared to suck up the food it was given. She would elaborate that it didn't eat the food as much as it consumed it. Regardless of her concerns as to exactly what her mother-in-law had found in the woods that night, Tamara left without incident. However, word of the strange creature soon got out around the village, not least because of the old lady's own accounts of her new baby. Although it isn't certain if one of the villagers reported her or if the authorities became aware of these rumors, but several weeks later, the elderly lady suddenly became ill. So much so, in fact, that she was hospitalized and ultimately admitted to a mental institution due to her odd behavior, and even odder statements of having left a baby at home in her apartment, claims hospital staff dismissed as crazy ramblings. It is here where there are several variations on what happened next. Most importantly, though, and a detail that remains constant throughout the slightly differing visions, is that the younger Tamara returned to her mother-in-law's apartment several days later. To her horror, she discovered Alashenka now dead. She would contact a mutual friend, Vladimir Nerdinov, who met her at the apartment. The pair were unsure of what to do and who to contact. Ultimately, they decided to inform a local policeman, Vladimir Bendlin. Although he was more than perplexed by the account they offered him, when confronted with the morose remains, he agreed to have them examined. He would take the remains to Dr. Irina Yermolevya, whose conclusions were that they were the mummified remains of a disfigured child, possibly a far-reaching consequence of the 1957 nuclear Kishtim disaster. However, when Bedlin asked another medical assistant, Lyubov Romania, to perform an examination of the remains, the conclusions were far different. Romuanova was an expert in child deformities, and her overriding findings were that the remains were simply not human. She would point out 20 key differences and anomalies in the skull of this creature, for example, and a human one, perhaps not least, that the creature's skull consisted of 4 separate bones with sharp edges, not at all how a human skull would be, disfigured or not. A short time after these findings, the rumors of an alien baby escaped the confines of the village and seeped out into the wider population of surrounding cities and eventually to other countries. Almost overnight, the small village became the focus of UFO researchers and enthusiasts, news channels and television stations, and just general onlookers. What's more, many of the television stations present were more than happy to pay people for their knowledge of Alashenka, meaning the story continued to grow by the minute. Particular attention was focused on Tamara and Vladimir Nerdinov, with some people accusing them of being perpetrators of a hoax. However, there was no evidence that either had gained monetarily from their claims. And what's more, tests on the remains had proven that it had indeed once been living tissue. Essentially, whatever Alashenka was, it was once alive. It was around this time that the case took a turn of sorts. Respected UFO researcher Boris Zolotiv arrived in the village. More importantly, he offered to have DNA testing undertaken on the remains. Bedlin agreed, and they were handed over to the ufologist, the remains never to be seen again. Incidentally, several months after he took charge of the remains of Alashenka, Zotolov was tracked down by a television station that had taken an interest in the case. He would offer, perhaps bizarrely, that his assistant was driving the remains to the lab when a UFO landed right in front of their car. What's more, the occupants got out of the craft and took the remains with them. How truthful the explanation offered for Alashenka's disappearance is open to debate. Some people have put forward that Zolotov arranged for the sale of the remains for financial gain, while others suggest that rather than aliens landing on the road to take charge of the remains, they somehow found their way into the possession of the Russian Secret Intelligence Service. We will likely never know for certain exactly what happened to them or where they might be today. There were, though, several final twists to the tale. Although the remains had disappeared, Bedlin would come into possession of the shawl that her mother-in-law had initially wrapped Alashenka in when a local woman, who wished to remain anonymous, came forward to say that she had taken it into her possession when the elderly lady was hospitalized. She happily handed the item over to Bedlin so that DNA tests could be carried out. When those tests were complete, the results were intriguing, to say the least. They would come back with 2 different sets of DNA on them. One of these was human, almost certainly the elderly lady's. The other, however, was a much more head-scratching, being classed as unknown to science. If we assume that the DNA was Alashenka's, which is almost certainly, then what exactly was this mysterious creature and where did it come from? A more disturbing twist occurred several months after the events had become worldwide news when the elderly lady somehow managed to escape from the mental health facility. She was, though, killed in a mysterious hit-and-run accident shortly after. Many people would question just how such an elderly lady could have freed herself from the facility in the first place, and suggested she might have been intentionally allowed to walk free in order that she could be assassinated. Of course, who might have been behind such a speculative targeted attack remains a mystery. Perhaps of even more concern is the fact that the elderly lady had arranged to meet hypnotic regression expert Mark Milkheimer at the hospital so that he could try to shine further light on the strange encounter. Only days after he arrived in Kishtim, shortly after Tamara's death, he died of a sudden heart attack, a death that also raised an eyebrow or two in some corners. Was Alashenka an alien baby that somehow became abandoned in the woodland near a Russian village? If so, were the remains taken back by those aliens, or were they intercepted by the Russian authorities? And how did it become to be left in the woodland in the first place? Was it left behind following an alien visitation, or does it suggest a more permanent extraterrestrial presence on our planet? Or was the incident indeed a case of a tragically deformed and abandoned child that was spun out of control by a thirsty media? The truth is, the tale of Alashenka will likely remain shrouded in mystery for the foreseeable future. In the book Forbidden Archaeology, authors Richard Thompson and Michael Cremo essentially stated that academic science was engaged in a massive cover-up regarding the history and origins of the human race on Earth. Nonsense? Perhaps not. Working under a grant from the National Science Foundation in 1966, Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her team had been commissioned to date 2 archaeological sites in Mexico, namely Huehuetlacco, where the very sophisticated stone tools had been unearthed, and El Horno, where other interesting, if less sophisticated items had been discovered. Initial estimates dated the sites at 20,000 years old, which, according to thinking of the time, would have put the sites close to the dawn of human civilization, at least in the Americas. Dr. Steen McIntyre used 4 clear and accepted methods to test the sites. Every time the results came back, they were the same, and they were a long way off the estimates. According to Dr. Steen McIntyre's tests, the sites were closer to 250,000 years old. Her results went against everything accepted science stated it knew. However, instead of being applauded and hailed for having made such a breakthrough in our knowledge of human history, bearing in mind she had solid results to back up her theory, she was instead ridiculed and her character vilified. She struggled to maintain steady work in her field after making her claims. A warning to others? Over 100 years earlier, when gold was discovered in abundance at Table Mountain in California, following the digging and mining that went thousands of feet down into the earth, hundreds of stone artifacts and even human fossils were discovered. The age of the site and the remains, according to then California State Geologist J.D. Whitney, was anywhere from 9 to 55 million years old. Like Dr. Steen McIntyre, Whitney offered an abundance of evidence and in-depth reports on the finds. However, despite this, he was dismissed and his findings almost erased from the record and history books. The site was sealed, almost as if nothing had ever been found. Perhaps even stranger are some of the South African mines, where for decades miners have brought to the surface from deep inside the mines themselves hundreds of small metallic spheres, each with encircling parallel grooves. The site itself and the level at which these spheres are found are anywhere up to 3 billion years old. Despite these remarkable finds, mainstream science refuses to acknowledge them, and no seriously funded studies have been carried out on them or their origins. One of the most controversial theories put forward to and ultimately rejected from mainstream science and history was that of Immanuel Velikovsky. Immanuel Velikovsky seemed to outrage mainstream thinking in 1950 when he released his book Worlds in Collision and stated that cataclysmic disasters recorded in the Bible and echoed in other ancient writings such as the ancient Egyptians, the Mayas to name just 2, were convulsions of the universe that our ancestors deep in antiquity witnessed firsthand, including Venus and Mars being dragged into orbits too close to the Earth. Velikovsky stated that Venus was once part of the planet Jupiter until around 4,000 years ago when an explosion catapulted it into space, blazing brightly and trailing a slipstream of dust and gases as it went. He further stated that the Earth moved into the outer edges of the slipstream around the 15th century BC, which resulted in a red dust covering the rain that fell. Velikovsky cited the Book of Exodus, which reads, "All the water that was in the Nile turned to blood." This was then followed by showers of meteorites as Venus passed, which Velikovsky said was documented clearly in the Mexican annals. The sky rained not water, but fire and red-hot stones. As Venus passed on its way, Earth was pulled off its axis by the gravitational pull, and hurricanes and massive floods took place on Earth. The Caxinhua of Brazil wrote that heaven and earth changed places, and Persian records state that 3 days of light was followed by 3 days of darkness. Velikovsky even went on as far to say that it was at this moment in time when Moses led the Israelites across the Sea of Passage, whose waters had parted, he claimed, due to gravitational and electromagnetic forces between the two planets, and for the same reason they came crashing back to their rightful place, covering the seabed. Venus swung past Earth again in the 14th century BC, bringing with it equally destructive effects before finally settling into its current orbit. In the 8th century BC, however, Venus this time came too close to Mars and pushed it into an orbit that clashed with that of Earth, and did so every 15 years until 687 BC, when it finally settled into its own orbit. Again, Velikovsky offered proof of these accounts from the Bible and ancient writings, including the following from the Chinese bamboo books that stated, "The stars fell like rain and the earth shook." He also pointed to the fact that it seemed to be around this time in history that Mars replaced Venus as the prominent, most powerful god in both Roman and Greek cultures. Indeed, even the scar on Mars was cited as being the result of electromagnetic energy between the two celestial bodies that had all but collided. Wild claims that they were disregarded and mocked in equal measure. Was he right? We will probably never know for sure, but let's take a quick look at some of his, then, wild claims, and then have since been proven and accepted by mainstream science as now fact. For example, he argues that Venus was incandescent in ancient times and would essentially still be a planet with soaring temperatures. Velikovsky was scoffed at for this claim. Conventional wisdom at the time said proof stated Venus was freezing due to thick cloud. However, in 1962, NASA's Mariner 2 satellite showed the surface temperature to be 800 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt lead. It was then discovered that actual temperatures on the planet were in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. He also claimed that Jupiter, the planet that he had stated projected what would become Venus into the solar system, emitted radio noise. By 1960, it was proven that Jupiter had a radiation belt that emitted over 1,000 times more energy than Earth's Van Allen belt. Another key claim, especially given his claims of the Venus slipstream, was that some cometary tails and meteorites contain hydrocarbons. Around a year after his wild claim, it was proven to be exactly right, and before the end of the 1950s, it was confirmed that hydrocarbons in meteorites were made of many of the same compounds as those on Earth. If there is evidence and proof that differs from our accepted version of history, more than if it is being covered up from the general population, we should ask why. Why would this knowledge want to be hidden from us? Is it because they feel that the organized religion would suffer and essentially be made irrelevant should we discover that our history on Earth is not as we've been taught? Is it simply to save the embarrassment and laborious task of having to rewrite our history as though we knew it? Enough evidence is there to warrant serious study into these and many more claims that suggest we have only gotten a piece of the story. Might there perhaps have been civilizations that existed here on Earth millions, perhaps billions of years ago and were simply wiped off the face of the planet and over time have literally been forgotten? What would happen to us if a cataclysmic event wiped out the human race? Over the thousands of years that it might take for life to start again, what would happen to our infrastructure, our records? We may become just as forgotten and life may start again, entirely from scratch, and one day that they would think that their race was the first civilization, and before that there was nothing. How wrong could they be? The Nommo are primordial ancestral spirits in Dogon religion and cosmology, though some researchers are convinced that they may in fact be aliens. In one story of the Dogon of West Africa, an ark descended to the ground, bringing advanced amphibious beings known as the Nommo. These beings gave the Dogon advanced information about an invisible companion to the star Sirius, which was extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. It would one day be known to astronomers as Sirius B. The Dogon are an ethnic group of around 600,000 people, most of who live in the rocky hills, mountains and plateaus of the Bandiagara escarpment in the Middle Plateau region of Mali. The ancestors of the Dogon came from the area of Mande in southwest Mali and northeast Guinea that was the center of the 13th century Mali Empire. After the collapse of this empire, the Dogon migrated to their current rocky home. The cliffs and difficult terrain where the Dogon settled offered effective protection from raids by slave traders coming from the desert, though they also resulted in the isolation of communities. When Mali became a part of French West Africa in the 1890s, the slave raids ended, and the Dogon were able to expand into the plains around the plateau. Unfortunately, this migration separated the Dogon from their religious sites, making room for Islam and Christianity. But the Dogon are still known for their intricate cosmology and extraordinary rituals that go with it. Their mask dances are now tourist attractions. Indeed, after a mask has been used in these ritualist celebrations, it is no longer considered sacred and is often sold to tourists. Dogon religion is devoted mainly to worshipping the ancestors and the spirits they encountered when they migrated across the western Sudan. For every 60 years, the Dogon perform a religious ceremony called the Sigui, corresponding to the duration of the life of the first Dogon ancestor. The ceremony occurs when the star Sirius appears between two mountain peaks and is celebrated over 7 years, during which time the great mask is carved from a single piece of wood. These masks are incredibly tall and symbolically complex, and their elaborate dance reenacts the creation of the Dogon culture. This and all Dogon ceremonies are organized by members of the Awa, a male initiation society with important ritual and political roles within the Dogon society. Awa society members are also responsible for the creation and performance of the masks, all of which portray the face as a rectangular box with deeply hollowed channels for the eyes. Sirius, also known as the Dog Star in the constellation Canis Major, is the brightest star in the night sky. The bright part of the binary is a blue-white star, 25.4 times as luminous as the Sun. Sirius was known as Sothis to the ancient Egyptians, who knew that it made its first heliacal rising, rose just before sunrise, of the year at around the time of the annual floods were beginning in the Nile Delta. In ancient Rome and Greece, the hottest part of the year was connected with the heliacal rising of the Dog Star, an association that remains in the expression Dog Days. That Sirius as a binary star was first reported by the German astronomer Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel in 1844. The companion was first seen in 1862 by Alvan Clark, an American astronomer and telescope maker, and came as a complete surprise to astronomers. Sirius B is 10,000 times dimmer than Sirius. Consequently, it's extremely difficult to see from Earth. In fact, astronomers were not able to estimate its mass until 2005, when they were able to use data from the Hubble Space Telescope. From 1931 to 1956, French anthropologist Marcel Gréal and his student Germaine Detelen worked in Mali and lived among the Dogon, mainly by talking to a blind hunter named Ogotemeli. They found that some elements of the tribe's mythology were similar to that of ancient Egypt, especially the importance of Sirius in their traditions. The pair also discovered that the Dogon possessed impressive knowledge of certain aspects of modern astronomy. This knowledge included the belief that the Earth and other planets rotate on their axis and orbit the Sun, that Jupiter possesses 4 moons, and that Saturn is surrounded by a ring. Although this is impressive, such information can be obtained without modern technology, as can be seen by the work of ancient Greek astronomers and Copernicus. But it's not this knowledge that is the source of the controversy surrounding the Dogon. The cause of the debate was the claim that Ogotomeli told the anthropologist that the Dogon believed that Sirius, in their language Sigutolo, has a dark, invisible companion with a 50-year elliptical orbit. This companion is extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. In other words, Sirius B. Apparently around 15% of all Dogon adult males were initiated into the Sirius lore. But how could a remote people who lacked any kind of astronomical device obtain such information about an invisible star? Griel first published this extraordinary data on the Dogon in 1948 and included it in a representation of the Sirius B system drawn by Ogotomeli. One theory to explain the advanced astronomical knowledge of the Dogon was put forward by author Robert Temple in his book The Sirius Mystery, first published in 1976. An advertisement for its second 1998 edition, called The Sirius Mystery, New Scientific Evidence of Alien Contact 5,000 Years Ago, stated Temple's extreme hypothesis about the Dogon and Sirius B. He said, "Convincing evidence that the Egyptian, Sumerian and Dogon civilizations were founded by aliens from the Sirius star system who are now ready to return. New scientific evidence that solidifies the hypothesis that the KGB, CIA and NASA attempted to suppress. An awe-inspiring work of research that calls for a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe." The Sirius Mystery in 1976 set the world abuzz with talk of an extraterrestrial origin to human civilization and triggered a 15-year persecution campaign against Robert Temple by the KGB, CIA and NASA and other government agencies. Undaunted, however, Temple is back with 140 pages of new scientific evidence that makes his hypothesis more compelling than ever. Many authors have speculated on the subject of extraterrestrial contact, but never before has such detailed evidence been presented. Temple applies his in-depth knowledge of ancient history, mythology, Pythagorean physics, chaos theory, and Greek to a close examination of the measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was built to align directly with the star Sirius. He concludes that the alien civilization of Sirius and our own civilization are part of the same harmonic system and are destined to function and resonate together. His findings warrant a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe. Temple's book also states that thousands of years ago an ark descended to the ground with great noise and in a swirling wind and brought amphibious alien beings known as the Nommo to the Dogon. It was these beings who told the tribesmen about Sirius B. The Dogon were also told that the Nommo lived on a planet that orbits another star in the Sirius system. This account follows Dogon mythology fairly closely. In Dogon tradition, Nommo was the creator spirit who emerged with a female twin and several more pairs of Nommo from the cosmic egg Amma. The first Dogon primordial ancestors were thus bisexual water gods created in heaven by Amma and descended from heaven to earth in an ark. Many scientists reacted to Temple's claims by saying that the advanced knowledge about Sirius probably came from Western visitors who discussed astronomy with the Dogon priests. The priests then added this new information to their older traditions. They also pointed out that Grail was an amateur astronomer and could well have used his knowledge to rationalize the rather disorganized Dogon traditions that even tribal members could not agree on. In 1995, two French researchers, Daniel Benest and J.L. Duvent, had an article published in the journal Astronomy and Astrophysics entitled "Is Sirius a Triple Star?", which suggested that there was a small third star in the Sirius system. They believe the star may be a type known as a red dwarf and probably has only about 0.5 the mass of Sirius B. Some researchers have wondered, could this newly discovered star be the home of the Nommo? Does the mythology of the Wajina tribes in Australia offer proof of the ancient astronaut theory? Creation stories about sky beings from the clouds and cave paintings that look like typical grey aliens of our modern world have some people convinced this is very much the case. Could there be more truth to the notion that extraterrestrials landed in what we recognize today as Australia and sparked the Wandjina tribes? And were these extraterrestrials the gods in the creation stories and myths of these indigenous people? The three Wandjina tribes, the Wurrara, the Nagarinyin, and the Wunabul, had a history that went back thousands and thousands of years and was one that was uncontaminated by the outside world until the late 18th century, when the arrival of European explorers on the shores of Australia occurred. And perhaps because of this, the creation stories and legends of the Wandjina are particularly thought-provoking. Without a doubt, one of the most compelling reasons to contemplate whether the tribe's roots go back to extraterrestrial contact in ancient times is some of the cave paintings that reside in the Western Kimberley region of northwestern Australia. This artwork is said to date back at least 4,000 years, if not earlier. The similarities between these figures painted somewhere around 2000 BC are undeniably similar to how we would perceive a grey alien being in the modern world. They clearly depict, for example, a head larger than their frame would suggest, as well as a pale, white-grey skin and larger black eyes. Did creatures such as these visit the ancestors of the Wandjina tribe thousands of years ago? While the depictions could be nothing but coincidence, we have to accept that these ancient people would have drawn exactly what they saw. Were the people drawing what we would recognize as a grey alien in the modern world? We should note that perhaps researchers as well as members of the Wandjina people themselves reject the notion that these cave paintings represent alien entities and instead claim they are simply representations of nature and the natural world their ancestors were surrounded with. It isn't merely the artwork, however. Many of their creation stories are similarly thought-provoking. For example, the first Wandjina people were said to be sky beings or spirits from the clouds who came to Earth from elsewhere in the Milky Way. Ultimately, they created Earth and all life, both animal and plant life, before eventually returning to their cosmic home elsewhere in the galaxy. Before leaving, though, they would teach humans the secrets of the arts, science, astronomy, and agriculture. Clearly, all of these aspects of the creation stories of the Wandjina people resonate almost perfectly with multiple other civilizations from around the world. Could this suggest that the legends of the Anunnaki, extraterrestrials who came to Earth millions of years ago, are the origins of these multiple creation stories, each one spawned as these alien colonizers spread ever outward, bringing their teachings to those who they found on the way? With these suggestions of alien connections to the Wandjina people, it's probably worth examining the legends of the supreme deity Jama and his apparent use of a flying machine. For example, in one location where this advanced vehicle arrived and left from, there was a baldness of the surrounding rock and trees that had severely damaged bark. What's more, when this vehicle came and went, it brought with it a monstrously loud noise. It's clear even to a skeptic that from a modern perspective, this could very well be describing a nuts and bolts aircraft, and a highly advanced one at that. And it's also worth recalling that multiple other cultures and civilizations around the world have similar legends of entities arriving from the sky in vehicles, or sometimes depicted as animals that make a brilliant noise upon arrival and whose flames often cause damage to the ground when arriving and leaving. It's also of interest to note that many UFO reports from Australia today feature the detail of a particularly loud noise when they're viewed. Might this suggest that whatever extraterrestrial presence was in this part of the world thousands of years ago still be here today? Could it be, for reasons unknown to us, that Australia is of particular interest and importance to these extraterrestrial visitors, maybe for its location, or resources perhaps? It's also worth mentioning the Black Mountains that reside directly east, almost in a straight line on the other side of the country. Not only do these multiple black slabs make up the mountains there, slabs that could very well be the ruined remains of an ancient spaceport, but many pilots who fly over the region experience multiple issues with their navigation equipment. Might these ancient mountains be a further testament to an extraterrestrial presence in Australia in the distant past? What is of further interest to those who believe ancient extraterrestrial contact with the ancestors of the Wandjina people is more reality than myth are recent archaeological discoveries that would appear to corroborate at least certain Wandjina legends. Perhaps the best example would be the discovery of the remains of megafauna in the region. This matches very well the accounts of extraordinary large mammals in the Wandjina legends that state once shared the land with them. What's more, while mainstream scholars suggest that the northwestern parts of Australia were likely populated as far back as 60,000 years ago, the result of migrating peoples from Africa, the remains of objects at some sites in the region, suggest an origin that goes much further back to around 175,000 years at the very least. In fact, some researchers have suggested dates even earlier than that. With this in mind, we should also turn our attention to the work of Professors Alan Wilson and Rebecca Kane. In their paper, The Recent African Genesis of Humans, they would conclude that all human life could be traced back to the African continent somewhere around 200,000 years ago. However, not long after releasing the paper, they would publicly declare they had been wrong in their original conclusions and that their most recent findings suggested that the origins of Homo sapiens go much further back than people had previously thought, sometime around 400,000 years ago. And what's more, these origins began with the Aborigine people of Australia, who arose from two distinctive lineages. Even more conclusive, as far as Wilson and Kane were concerned, is that proof of these origins was not present in just one or two locations, but in at least 10 different sites. There is much to contemplate from Wilson and Kane's conclusions and how it might tie in with the creation stories of not only the Wandjina people, but also others around the world, all of which would appear to stem from one original source, those of the Anunnaki. If we accept that the Anunnaki, as the legends state, created humans by mixing their DNA with the most prominent humanoid on the Earth to create a worker race, might that genetic manipulation program have taken place in what is today Australia? Might Australia essentially have been the Garden of Eden of biblical myth? It is certainly an intriguing speculation. Could Australia have much more of an active involvement in these potential events of the distant past than many might have thought? Was there a possible Anunnaki presence here in this part of the world, and might it be they who influenced the guided of the Wandjina ancestors of the Wandjina tribes? Could the origins of the Wandjina really be extraterrestrial in nature? And do many cave paintings in the northwestern regions of Australia look like grey alien beings because that is exactly what they are? And might these grey aliens and the Anunnaki be one of the same? And if this is true, what does it mean for other similar creation stories around the world, as well as world history in general? Might such seemingly crazy notions of an extraterrestrial race coming to Earth thousands of years ago and then spawning a global human civilization, one that would in turn spawn the many civilizations of our ancient times, have more accuracy and truth to them than most would even dare to believe? The legends of the Wandjina people are certainly thought-provoking, intriguing, and quite possibly ones that have further secrets to reveal. As always, with such huge questions and contemplations, the ramifications for our collective history are huge. However, if we wish to obtain an accurate view of human origins, then they are questions and contemplations that are very much required.
The San Fernando Valley is no stranger to UFOs. There's been quite a large number of incidents reported over the last 20 years. Strange balls of light and even large triangular crafts have been sighted. Though a thorough investigation have been carried out numerous times, these mysterious objects remain unexplained. But as you'll discover, those who have witnessed UFOs may go on to have far more unusual encounters. Nobody knows for sure what these mysterious beings were doing in the area of a local school. It's almost surprising that they didn't engage with Susan, even though they came more or less eye to eye. For Susan, her life has changed dramatically, as you can imagine. She now knows not to dismiss such stories of UFOs and their occupants so easily. Though she remains curious, she recalls how scared she was and hopes never to come eye to eye with these beings ever again.
Many people believe that alien encounters take place only in remote areas. Nothing, however, could be further from the truth. In fact, aliens seemingly turn up in some of the most unexpected places. For example, the following incident involves an encounter that took place in the front courtyard of an elementary school in the middle of a densely populated suburb of Los Angeles. It also involves one of the clearest and most extensive descriptions of alien beings researchers had ever investigated, which all started with a UFO sighting a few years earlier. The witness, Suzanne D., worked as an art designer within 10 miles of where her encounter took place. Suzanne was attending Northridge University, earning a bachelor's degree. She lived with her mother and brother in Van Nuys in Southern California. Actually, her ordeal began with a very dramatic UFO sighting near her home in the San Fernando Valley. What's interesting about this sighting is that the UFO was seen hovering over the highly technical Lockheed and Hughes aircraft installations and the Van Nuys Air Force Reserve Base. It was a summer night in 1980 when Suzanne and two friends witnessed a triangular formation of lights hovering in the sky. As an artist, Suzanne is a trained observer with an acute eye for details and an incredible memory. Because of this, she's able to fully describe her encounter. As she says in her own words, "It was a beautiful night, very clear, and it was very warm. I was standing there looking out and I realized that the sky didn't look normal. I'm looking at the moon and I'm thinking, that's not normal. It's all orange over there. It's 2 o'clock in the morning and it's orange." And so I was looking at it and I realized that what I was looking at was the glow coming off these three objects. There was one really big object and two smaller ones on either side of it and above it. As Suzanne studied the objects, she saw that they hovered below the horizon of the mountains. She estimated their distance to be about 10 miles, but like many UFO witnesses, she had trouble estimating the size of the objects. The objects in the middle was huge, and the ones on either side appeared to be about 1/3 of its size. When asked what the objects looked like, she replied, "Sort of a saucer shape. I mean, it was flat, and they appeared to be rounded, but they were so far away that I wasn't underneath them. I couldn't see under them. I was seeing more of a profile view. They were elliptical." Suzanne concluded that she was seeing three separate objects. As she says, they were hovering on either side of it, above it, so they formed a sort of a triangle. The big one was lower, and it was at the bottom point of the triangle. She said, "I sat there and watched them for a couple of minutes, and they weren't moving. All the orange glow in the night sky was coming off them. They, the objects, didn't appear orange. They appeared shiny, maybe metallic. But all this orange glow was around them. It was lighting up the whole area around them, orange, like streetlights glow. That's what it was like, but it was orange." Suzanne literally could not believe her own eyes and ran inside to get her friends. She dragged them out, pointing to the sky. "Do you see that?" she asked Suzanne's friend. Adlai Fredrickson remembers the incident well. Many UFO investigators have noticed a high number of UFO sightings around high-technology installations, and that is certainly true in this case. After the sighting, none of them thought there would be many future encounters. However, in Suzanne's case, it wasn't long before she had a truly incredible encounter, a face-to-face confrontation with two Grey-type alien beings. And this encounter occurred in the most unlikely place imaginable, right in front of the local elementary school. One evening in 1980, about 3 years following Suzanne's UFO sighting, she decided to take a walk with her dog around the block. She had no idea that she was about to walk into the single most terrifying experience of her entire life. Here Suzanne vividly describes what it's like to have a close-up encounter with extraterrestrials. I was in college and my girlfriend and I did art projects together. We had this one project we were working on. We were collecting shopping trolleys that you find hanging out on street corners. Lonely shopping trolleys with nobody to push them around. We had already collected 2 or 3 and we were going to make this great art project out of them. We thought it was really esoteric, so we had these shopping trolleys. One night I was driving home. It must have been about 11:30 at night. It was quiet and very little activity out on the streets. I spotted another trolley. I don't know why it didn't occur to me to just stop and put it in my car. For some reason I thought, well, I'll drive home and I'll take Sarah, my dog, for a walk and I'll go and get the shopping trolley and then put it in my car. The lonely shopping trolley was down on the corner of Strathern and Amerstoy. Amerstoy runs in front of Stagg Street Elementary School and Strathern runs across it. So for some reason, I decided that I should take my car home and go back and get the shopping cart and bring it home. Looking back at it, it would have made a hell of a lot more sense just to stop and put the shopping cart in my car and drive away. I had a station wagon, so the trolley would have easily gone into the back. So I called in home and got the dog and went for a walk, and we went to get the shopping trolley. I was walking in a circular route. I went up my street to Strathern, down Strathern to Amerstoy, picked up the shopping cart and was going past the school to Stagg. As I'm going down Amerstoy, I had to go past the school. I was being careful not to attract too much attention. I guess the shopping trolley made me look a little suspicious. There aren't lots of houses, almost no houses on that side because of the school, so I thought it would be very easy to get it past the school. So I'm making my way past the school and I got up near the front of the school gates where the administration block was. There, an open area, a theatre, and the administration area and the kindergarten, all on the school frontage and right in front of the theatre. There's a big illuminated open area with a flagpole. So I'm coming past there and I'm thinking I'm totally alone and I'm not going to be seen by anybody. Then I looked to my right and realized that there were 2, what I thought at first were people. I thought there were just 2 people standing there talking. At this time the school's on my right and I was on the footpath in front of the school. It was at this point that Suzanne first began to realize that something strange was happening. She could understand 2 people standing in front of the school, but when she looked at them, she noticed immediately that something was horribly wrong with the way the people looked. At first she thought they were children and didn't pay too much attention, but as they got closer, she realized that there was no way they could be children. They looked much too different. Suzanne continues, they were facing each other. As I looked at them, I started to notice they were kind of strange. They had on these dark green jumpsuits. They had really big heads. And they weren't very tall. They were like my height, about 5'4", but I wasn't really impacted with their presence until they turned to look at me. They turned simultaneously away from each other and both towards me without moving their feet. They just sort of hovered and turned. At this point, investigators asked Suzanne to describe exactly what the 2 figures looked like with all the details she could remember. She proceeded to give one of the clearest and most complete descriptions they'd ever heard. In Suzanne's own words, okay, the heads were really big. They were abnormally large, like twice the size of a human head. The skulls were grossly exaggerated. They didn't really seem to have any ears or nose, and they seemed to have some slight indication of a mouth. They had really big eyes. I don't really remember seeing whites in their eyes. I just remember that they had really big dark eyes. Big almond eyes. Their heads were, well, it was like they had a big crease in their head, like 2 lobes. It was like you could see the lobes of their brains sticking out. Their arms were just hanging at their sides. It seemed like they had hands and their skin was all just pale, really, really white, like they could have been dead. They They were so white. You know, if they had been human, they would have been dead. I don't remember seeing any feet, and their jumpsuits were all this dark olive green color, and it came up like a mandarin collar around their necks, and it was just very plain. I didn't notice much of anything. At the point when they turned to face me, I was parallel with them. We see each other, and as I keep walking, at the point to which I was straight in front of them, they were both standing facing me, and at that point, I realized that they weren't normal. They probably weren't human. They didn't move like humans. They didn't look like humans. Investigators asked Suzanne if the figures could possibly have been children wearing Halloween masks, but she denied this possibility. As she says, "No, I didn't really think they were children in masks. They were too big to be children unless they were maybe boys. They couldn't have been girls, unless they were totally flat-chested. It would have been an elaborate costume. They were identical, and they were in the spotlights where I could see them. But the light was behind them, so whatever was on their clothing all just kind of blended into the grey olive green color because the light was coming from over their shoulders. So I didn't see a lot of detail in their clothes. It was mostly silhouette, but their skin was so white, it was pretty easy to see their eyes and the shape of their head." As Suzanne walked along the sidewalk, she approached to within 20 feet of the two figures. Her fright at this point bordered on panic. She didn't receive any mental messages, only an intense feeling of shock and fear. I felt like I got more and more scared as I realized more and more that this was something I'd never experienced before. They didn't move like humans either. They didn't look like humans. They didn't say anything. The point at which I would have had to start looking back over my shoulder at them, and by that point I was so scared all I could think about was just getting the hell out of there. And the whole time I'm pushing this stupid shopping trolley and it's rattling down the road. Sarah, my dog, didn't freak out at all. She just kept walking next to me the whole time. She sure didn't go up and try to sniff them. I was terrified, I didn't know what they were. I didn't. At one point I thought, my God, they're going to follow me home. Oh no, I'm going to die. I'm so scared. So I was walking as fast as I could without running and without making an enormous amount of noise with the stupid shopping trolley. Once I got out of the light, and a little way down the road, there was a clump of bushes. I ditched the shopping trolley in the bushes and all I wanted to do was get out of there, without running, without being obviously frightened to death. I didn't run. I walked as fast as I could straight home without looking over my shoulder. I felt that they were right behind me the whole time, but I didn't look over my shoulder. Suzanne's encounter with extraterrestrials, although extremely frightening, was actually totally benign. They never hurt her, followed her, or made any aggressive actions. Her fear was based solely on her own shock at seeing something so totally out of her normal experience. In fact, the shock of seeing them was so great that Suzanne says it was like being woken up when you're awake. At the time of the encounter, Suzanne had no idea what she was seeing. She'd never read anything about UFOs, and her knowledge of the subject was limited to her own recent sighting. Yet her description of the alien beings matches the descriptions of other witnesses, detail for detail. The large bald heads, the short stature, the white skin, the large almond eyes, the total lack of visible ears, nose and mouth, the greenish jumpsuits, the alien's identical appearance. All of these details corroborate exactly with other reports of which Suzanne knew nothing. In fact, Suzanne simply assumed that it was a unique experience. It bewildered her to such an extent that she told nobody about it for several years. One detail that absolutely astonished Suzanne was the way the figures moved in perfect unison. This detail has been observed over and over again by other witnesses. The alien abduction researcher Bud Hopkins had written a book entitled Intruders, where he lists several cases that involve the simultaneous leaning, blinking, and stepping of alien creatures. It's as if they are so telepathic that they're able to predict each other's movements. Still another detail that adds to the authenticity of her account is how it began. Suzanne had the totally illogical impulse to delay the picking up of her shopping cart until she could return to it and push it home. Her hindsight showed her how illogical this impulse was. Suzanne, of course, had no idea that many other people's encounters often begin in the same way. Preludes to many missing time abductions often include bizarre impulses to drive or walk to certain areas. Suzanne had no idea how close she was to having a full-blown contact. As far as she knows, she didn't have any missing time. She had no nightmares of the incident, nor has she found any mysterious scars on her body that might indicate an abduction-type experience. She does admit, however, that it is possible that her experience was more extensive than she can remember. She doesn't remember the exact time she left her home, nor the exact time she returned. However, if she did have missing time, she has no desire to undergo hypnosis and dredge up memories of an experience that was already considerably traumatizing. One detail that made Suzanne doubt she saw aliens was the lack of a UFO. It wasn't until much later that Suzanne even connected her previous UFO sighting to the concept of extraterrestrials, simply because there was no craft associated with this encounter. She does admit, however, that it would have been quite easy for a large craft to have landed in the enclosed playground of the school. It may seem incredible that her encounter took place in front of an elementary school in a crowded suburb. However, as many UFO researchers will tell you, this is not at all unusual. Many have investigated several other encounters that have taken place in the oddest locations, including hotels, condominiums, on freeways, even inside hospital rooms. It seems that the aliens have reached such a high level of technology that they can easily elude detection. In fact, less than 2 miles from the school, an entire family experienced a dramatic series of UFO encounters that started with simple sightings of star-like objects darting about the night sky and became dramatic bedroom visitations by grey-type aliens and culminated in at least 4 abductions, complete with bizarre experiments and a baby presentation aboard an alien craft. All this, of course, took place over a densely crowded suburb in the San Fernando Valley. Gremlins. They're nothing but fiction, right? The truth is, there are more accounts of real-life encounters with these beastly, mischievous, and sometimes deadly creatures than many of us perhaps realize. The earliest known mentioning of these truly bizarre creatures was an article in the Spectator newspaper in the early 1920s, which offered that the newly constituted Royal Air Force in the United Kingdom in 1918 had detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious sprites who would be responsible for a whole host of mysterious acts while pilots were in the air. Perhaps the earliest recorded encounter with these obscure beings took place in 1923, when a British pilot was forced to crash-land his aircraft into the waters off the English coast. He would later state that his reason for doing so was due to a tiny creature which had followed him aboard his plane. The bizarre entity had played havoc with his ability to control the aircraft, eventually forcing him to ditch the plane in the sea. One of the most unsettling accounts on record concerning potential real-life gremlins, though, occurred in San Diego, California in the summer of 1939. A record of the incident can be found in the book Our Haunted Planet, where John Keel relays an account first published in the magazine Flying Saucer Review by Jerome Clark. According to the report, a United States military cargo plane left the runway at Marine Naval Air Station in San Diego on its way to Honolulu in Hawaii. To begin with, the flight was textbook, with no reason for concern. Then, 3 hours after takeoff, several panic distress calls were received by the control tower in San Diego before the cargo plane went completely silent. All attempts to re-establish contact with aircraft went unanswered. Then, a short time after the distress calls were received, the strange situation took an even more bizarre twist. Much to the disbelief of those at the naval base was the sight of the aircraft returning to the runway where it had taken off from a little over 3 hours earlier. Personnel watched as the aircraft approached the runway and made a perfect landing, eventually coming to a stop. Within moments, emergency response units were approaching the aircraft, as well as a security unit who quickly gained entry to the plane. They were not all prepared for the scene that would greet them. All of the crew were dead, each of them having a huge gaping wound in their torso, as if they'd been ripped open by a mysterious clawed beast. There was a similar damage done to the interior of the aircraft. Even stranger, any of these security units who happened to touch these damaged parts of the plane would suffer a mysterious skin infection in the days that followed. The strangest and most bone-chilling discoveries, however, were made in the cockpit of the aircraft. There, the security unit found the pilot and co-pilot both dead, and both with the 45 automatic weapons in their hands, with several empty shell casings on the floor around them, as if they had spent their final moments firing at an unknown attacker. There was also a distinct thick odor of rotten eggs, something that is often noted at various encounters ranging from UFO sightings to the appearance of ghostly entities. Just how the pilots had managed to land the aircraft before succumbing to their deaths, and who the mysterious attacker was and where they had gone remains unexplained. The encounter on the US cargo plane is far from the only one. In fact, as the 1940s unfolded and the Second World War took hold around many parts of the planet, many more apparent accounts with real-life gremlins surfaced. Interestingly or not, many of these encounters occurred during reconnaissance flights, which took place at particularly high altitudes. Consequently, the conditions were much more pressured and in colder atmosphere. Whether these high-altitude conditions contributed to the many reports is a topic of debate for some. The Ministry of Defense took these reports so seriously, however, that they at one point suspected the sightings of these creatures were the result of German forces. This was the case until the British and American Air Forces shared information, eventually realizing that they were each suffering from the same phenomenon, and furthermore, following the end of the war when Allied forces had access to German records, they discovered that German pilots had reported the exact same encounters. In fact, one of the most unsettling, if intriguing encounters involved an American pilot known only as LW. It was while LW was piloting a Boeing B-17 aircraft when he heard a strange noise that appeared to be coming from the aircraft's engine. He also noticed that his navigation equipment was suddenly malfunctioning. It was as he was going through checks of this equipment that he noticed a truly bizarre creature looking at him through the cockpit window, clinging onto the outside of the aircraft. He would later describe the creature as having grey-green pointed ears and eyes that glowed a bright red color. Most unnerving of all, however, was that the mouth was full of truly razor-sharp teeth. The pilot looked on in disbelief as a second, almost identical creature appeared on the nose of the aircraft. A moment later, LW snapped back into his senses and immediately began to dive before leveling out again, repeating this several times until the disturbing creatures seemingly lost their grip on his aircraft. After eventually landing his aircraft, LW decided he would keep the bizarre encounter to himself. However, he would later hear several fellow pilots speaking of seeing an almost identical beast, which prompted him to make an official report to his superiors. A researcher who gathered several further Second World War encounters with apparent real-life gremlins was John Laming, who spent considerable time with both British and Australian aviation industries. One of these encounters was of Captain Wickner, who was delivering an Avro Lancaster bomber to an airbase in the United Kingdom in August 1944 when his engines suddenly cut out without warning. Using all of his experience as a pilot, Wickner managed to guide the plane to an emergency landing at the next available airbase. However, as soon as the plane's wheels touched the runway, the engines roared into life once more. Even stranger, Wickner was replaced as the pilot to deliver the plane, which was placed under armed guard until the replacement pilot arrived. Did the authorities know more than they let on? Another curious encounter unfolded 2 years previously in 1942 when Chris Jarrett was piloting a Lancaster plane over northern France on its way to a night bombing mission over Germany. However, before reaching its target location, the plane's engines suddenly failed, one at a time, until all 4 of them had died. Still carrying its full arsenal of bombs and most of its fuel, the aircraft began its rapid descent towards the ground. At a complete loss as to why the engines had ceased working so suddenly, Jarrett launched himself from the stricken plane, landing just in time to see the aircraft disappear over a hill in the distance before it became enveloped in flames as it impacted the ground. These engine failures, most often with Lancaster bombers, occurred more than records might officially state, and rumors among the pilots and Air Force personnel blamed these mysterious creatures gremlins. Interestingly or not, in the years that followed the end of the Second World War, reports of these creatures began to slow down dramatically, eventually stopping altogether. Although we should note that, according to some researchers, many military authorities would forbid the respective pilots from speaking of any such encounters around the same time, which might explain the sudden slowdown in encounters. While all of the encounters we have examined so far have taken place in the air, arguably one of the most well-known encounters with apparently goblin-like entities that could be very well perceived as gremlins occurred on land at an isolated residence in Kentucky on the evening of August the 21st, 1955. Interestingly enough, around the same time the aerial encounters began to slow down. On the night in question, the Sutton and Taylor family were enjoying an evening at the Suttons' home when, following a sighting of a strange glowing object that appeared to land in the nearby woods, they found their house surrounded by bizarre troll-like creatures with rat-like ears, long arms and clawed fingers and a row of sharp teeth. What followed was a standoff of sorts between the families and the strange creatures, which saw several shots fired at them by some members of the household. Bizarrely, the bullets appeared to bounce off these creatures as if they were made of bulletproof material. These menacing entities eventually retreated, and the entire episode remains unexplained almost 3/4 of a century later. Might the bizarre creatures that terrorized the 2 families that night in Kentucky have been the same mysterious entities that had harassed so many pilots in the air while in flight over the previous decades? Could it be possible that gremlins, grey-green goblin-like creatures bent on causing mischief with the potential to attack with their sharp claws and razor-like teeth really exist, and not simply be a fictional Hollywood creation? And if so, when will they show themselves again, and where? Did a woman suffer an attempted abduction at the hands of invisible aliens in France in 1950? Quite literally. An encounter known as the Black Hands case is without doubt one of the most thought-provoking and perplexing accounts connected to alien abduction on record. It is also one that is unique and an encounter that doesn't conform to other claims of extraterrestrial interaction, both of the times and in the modern era. According to the account, at around 4 p.m. on May the 19th, 1950, an unnamed woman was near the River Loire in Cours-les-Bas in France when she noticed a bright light, similar to a star, moving across the sky. She continued to watch this bizarre aerial anomaly until it came to a sudden stop. It remained motionless for several moments before rising into the sky, stopping and remaining still once more. Then, giving off a slight flash, the object disappeared high into the air with great speed. As perplexed and intrigued as she was, the woman, by and large, put the incident out of her mind. That is, until the following afternoon when she was walking along the river once more, she witnessed a similar light moving overhead, exactly as she had done the previous afternoon. This time, though, the light would come much closer to the woman. In fact, the light came so close that it almost enveloped her completely. Then, things turned even stranger and decidedly more ominous. To her shock and belief, the woman watched as 2 black-gloved hands emerged out of the light and reached towards her. She noticed how they had a yellow tint to them and were seemingly very strong. They remained where they were, as if ready to catch something thrown towards them. As she continued to watch them, and for reasons she didn't understand, she began walking forward towards the light. Almost as soon as she did so, the hands, with no visible arms, reached out and took hold of either side of her head. And what's more, they did so, violently squeezing hard on each side and shaking her head, and in turn, her entire body in a jerking motion. At one point, her head was pulled forward and she felt it strike an invisible torso, but one that appeared to be made of iron as opposed to flesh and bone. At the same time, she could feel the air around her turning increasingly cold as the squeezing on her head began once more. The fingers, which felt particularly cold and unhuman-like, covered her eyes, nostrils, and mouth. She struggled to breathe and began to panic somewhat. Then she felt something akin to a lightning bolt run through her. Suddenly, she began to swing back and forth, and she got the impression that the black hands were carrying her somewhere. The arms that the hands were seemingly attached to remained invisible to her, but she could almost definitely feel them against her shoulders. It was at this point that the distraught woman began to hear a strange, muffled laugh that, while it sounded as though it was coming from a relative distance, she assumed it came from her invisible attacker. Without warning, they came to a sudden stop. A moment later, she felt a blow to her back, seeming to her to have come from an invisible knee. So hard was the blow that it forced her to the ground, where a pressurized force immediately settled on her and forced her to lay down flat. After a moment or two, she was moving around, this time being dragged along the ground. This continued for several moments before they came to a stop once more. After several seconds, she heard a voice speak in French. It said, "There she is, we got her." Another voice replied, but this one was too muffled and too far away for her to make out what it had said. Before she could contemplate anything else, she found herself being dragged along the ground once more. This went on for some time, causing her to panic again. Just as she thought she was about to lose consciousness, the dragging stopped. She was free of the invisible grip and found herself laying alone in the middle of a field. She quickly checked her purse and found that all of her money was still there. Robbery, then, was not the reason for this obscure attack. She then got to her feet, brushed herself down, and quickly scanned her surroundings, fully expecting to find the person who had dragged her here to be watching her. However, there was nobody else there, and she was completely alone. Or at least she thought so. Just as she was beginning to think that her bizarre ordeal was over, she noticed a section of the grass in front of her pressed down, as if an invisible foot had just stepped there. She braced herself, expecting an invisible grip to seize her. However, nothing else happened, and all she could hear or feel was the wind blowing around her. She looked down at herself and realized that she had cuts and scratches on her arms and legs, while she could feel what appeared to be a burning sensation on her back. What's more, all of her muscles ached, and she had a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. As she looked around, she noted a light in one of the houses by the river. She started out towards it. However, after taking only a few steps, a blinding white light flashed before her eyes. She wasn't sure what had happened, but she had the impression that something had just taken off from the ground nearby and risen into the air with great speed. Now extremely frightened and confused, the woman made her way straight home. She would later report the encounter to the local police. A search of the field where she had found herself revealed strange scorch marks on the ground, and several of the trees had suffered considerable damage. However, despite these findings, there was no satisfactory explanation offered as to what had happened to the anonymous woman, and the case remains unresolved. Just what might have happened that evening? There are several possibilities for us to consider. Might it be that this unfortunate woman was the victim of an attempted alien abduction? If this is the case, why wasn't she taken on board a futuristic craft like many others who make such claims? And if aliens were behind this bizarre and unsettling attack, for what purpose was it carried out? It appeared that no experiments or communication took place. In fact, the whole episode seemed to revolve around the testing of some kind of technology that allowed someone or something the ability to physically take control of someone from a destination far away. Might we consider then that her tormentors, that late afternoon near the River Loire, were not of an extraterrestrial nature but were in fact human? We might recall that the witness heard somebody speaking in her native French, stating that we got her. Might this suggest that she was the unwilling participant in the testing of some kind of futuristic technology, one that allowed a person to physically grab and then control somebody from afar? We might also recall that while the witness could hear the voice of whom she presumed was her attacker clearly, the reply she heard was muffled and seemingly much further away. Might this also suggest some kind of remote technology with some kind of bizarre out-of-body remote control experiment taking place from a secret location many miles away? We know, for example, that remote viewing has been the subject of studies by various intelligence agencies around the world for decades. Might it be that this encounter with the black-gloved hands was another branch of these experiments, ones that allowed some kind of physical interaction? Or might those behind the attack on this mystery woman not have been extraterrestrial or human, but beings from another dimension? Might the light she witnessed, a light which grew much larger as it got closer, have been the result of a portal opening, and so allowing an interdimensional creature to reach through from their realm of existence into ours? And if so, was this an intentional crossing of dimensions on their part, or something that was a one-off opening of such gateways? Of course, regardless of who or what was behind the attack, perhaps the most important question would be, for what purpose was it carried out? Was it merely an opportunistic assault, or might there have been an agenda adhered to that is simply unknown to those who have investigated the case? The fact is, we are unlikely ever to know just what took place to the unnamed woman in France that spring afternoon in 1950. The account, though, continues to fascinate researchers today, almost 3/4 of a century later. And it is very much worth keeping this strange, curious encounter in the public consciousness, lest other similar incidents are uncovered or indeed take place in the future. Beginning in October 1939, the residents of Provincetown, Massachusetts, began hearing of bizarre and unsettling encounters experienced by the children of the town. All of the tales were the same. A tall, dark figure dressed entirely in black would leap out at the children before disappearing again into the night. Perhaps most unsettling of all were the menacing figure's glowing red eyes. To begin with, the townsfolk put the children's tales down to a combination of imagination, a mild case of hysteria, and the fact that Halloween was just around the corner. However, when a young woman came forward saying that she too had seen the bizarre figure, the sightings were treated a lot more seriously. This unsettling creature began to be referred to as the Black Flash, and for a time, the sightings and encounters with it gripped the entire community. It was during one late October evening when a local resident, Mary Costa, was making her way through the town. Now the summer tourists had gone, the area was a lot quieter and much more peaceful at night. However, that peacefulness was about to be swept away. Out of the corner of her eye, Mary noticed a shape leap out of the nearby bushes. By the time she had focused her attention on the figure, she realized it stood at least 8 feet tall, had glowing eyes and pointed silver ears. This disturbing figure stared at Mary for several moments before leaping high into the air, jumping and springing from walls and buildings until it was out of sight. She would run to a coffee shop a little way ahead whose light was one of the few on in the street. She told those inside what she'd seen, and despite several of the customers doing a search of the immediate vicinity, there was nothing to be found of the mysterious figure. She made a report to the police a short time later, and while they did indeed record the incident, they didn't take it too seriously. However, Mary's would be just the first of many reports to reach Provincetown law enforcement. Almost all of these reports were identical in detail. All mentioned a tall figure dressed in black, with some witnesses recalling seeing a cape. All claimed the figure had bizarre pointed ears and eyes that glowed. Some would even state these were blue, while others reported seeing red eyes. Even stranger, the figure's presence was usually accompanied by a strange buzzing sound, like that of a fly or a bee. And of course, almost against the laws of physics, the figure could jump high into the air and leap great distances. As if to make the police's job even more difficult, who were already struggling to keep up with the surge of sightings of the mystery menace, reports would often come in from 2 different locations at the same time. This suggested to them that this creature, whatever it was, could either move at exceptional speeds or there was more than one black flash. The vast majority of the encounters were also almost identical. This curious creature would leap out at people when they least suspected it, stare at them for several moments before disappearing out of sight, usually taking long leaps and jumps. However, some incidences were a little more intense than others. For example, one witness, Charles Farley, claimed to have fired his gun at the obscure creature, and what's more, he stated that he'd hit it. However, rather than fall to the floor, the figure simply laughed and then leapt over a particularly high fence and disappeared. Another witness, who remained anonymous, claimed that he was backed into a corner by the figure and so had no option but to throw a punch at it. When he did, though, the tall brute caught his fist in midair before crushing it in its grip, forcing the witness to the ground in pain. Before it disappeared, the witness saw bizarre blue flames coming out of its mouth. In fact, this detail about the blue flames emerging from the figure's mouth is particularly intriguing. It's hard to examine these enthralling, if strange, tales of the Black Flash of Provincetown without looking at the similarities to Spring-Heeled Jack, an almost identical assailant who terrified Victorian England for much of the 19th century. Aside from similarities in dress, Spring-Heeled Jack, as his moniker would suggest, had the ability to leap over tall walls and even buildings. What's more, many witnesses claim to have seen blue flames emerge from his mouth. Were these 2 creatures, separated by location and time, one and the same? Or might they perhaps be 2 different people but connected by the same secret technology? And if so, where is the technology now? Positioned near the northeastern coast of the United States and still feeling the effects of the Great Depression, the region's fishermen would tell of witnessing German submarines off the Atlantic coast, an obvious sign to them and many others throughout the United States that America would likely end up becoming involved in another war in Europe, despite the promises to the contrary of President Franklin Roosevelt. In the opening weeks of 1939, in the Wood End region of Provincetown, a bizarre sea monster would wash up on the shore. Rumours circled that this was the legendary sea beast that had been sighted by George Reedy almost half a century earlier in 1886, although it was later discovered to be nothing more but a decomposing basking shark. However, as bizarre as it might sound, it would seem these incidents almost set a subconscious tone throughout Provincetown for the final year of the 1930s, and this shows in the most bizarre ways. For example, according to an annual police report, and something that had not been adequately explained, records of people being bitten by dogs and cats in 1939 in the area is the highest on record, with no build-ups before or steady decline after. Simply a spike in these attacks on people by otherwise friendly pets. Even more concerning, and again with no obvious reason why, a sudden surge of arson attacks plagued the town throughout the month of September, just before the sightings of the Black Flash began. While many consider the Black Flash sightings unexplained and unresolved, the Chief of Police, Anthony Tarvers, believed he knew who was behind the encounters. According to his investigation, the Black Flash was actually the work of 4 local teenage boys whose reason was nothing more than to pull a prank on the general public. He claimed the 4 boys would split into 2 pairs and then, having one stand on the other, and disguise themselves as being around 8 foot tall. What's more, he claimed to have discovered the identity of one of the boys involved, and although he didn't name the person, he claimed in a public police statement that he would be speaking to the boy concerned and his family. Whether he did so or not remains unknown, but shortly after this public statement, the Black Flash sighting stopped. To some, though, regardless of the reasons why the sighting ceased, Tarver's explanation simply didn't hold water. Even assuming that the boys did manage to give the impression that they were an 8-foot-tall adult figure by simply standing on each other's shoulders, how were they able to execute such mammoth leaps, as reported by multiple people around the town? What's more, how could they withstand a bullet from close range, and how did they summon the strength to almost crush a grown man's hand? It's also important to mention that according to some researchers, the sightings didn't cease after only a few weeks in 1939, but continued, albeit sporadically, until late 1945, after the end of the Second World War. Whether this is true or not is open to debate. Might it be the case that Tarvers simply wanted to give the impression that the sightings had stopped before the town descended into hysteria? And if this was the case, were sightings largely suppressed as much as possible following this? And just who or what was the Black Flash of Provincetown? Was it some kind of cryptid creature unknown to science, or perhaps an extraterrestrial who seemingly disappeared into legend as quickly as it had emerged? Or should the connections to Spring-Heeled Jack from the previous century be examined further? Perhaps both entities were merely humans with some kind of advanced technical clothing that gave such powers as their ability to leap over tall walls and buildings, and to withstand bullet shots and physical assaults. The fact is, we're no closer to solving the mysterious Black Flash sightings today in the 21st century than we were when they happened in 1939. For now at least, all possibilities remain on the table, and the search for the identity of the Black Flash of Provincetown continues.